Mossdale Cave Incident. It was June 24, 1967, and 10 cavers were about to enter Mossdale Cavern to help clear some of the deeper passages and map them out. The two leaders of the group had already explored this cave before, which reassured everyone else. This particular cavern was known for its tight spaces and the very few areas where a person could fully stand. After a few hours inside, 4 of the cavers realized how difficult the cave actually was and decided to return to the surface. They noticed a cloudy sky, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The remaining cavers continued their descent until they reached the Far Marathon Passage, which measured only 18 inches by 12 inches, with a small stream of water flowing along the bottom. Everything seemed to be going well, and the group on the surface soon noticed that it had started raining, so they took cover. Initially, the rain did not seem concerning, but the cavers inside began to notice rising water levels. When the water became alarmingly high, they decided to end the day's work and head back, even though they were still 3 hours from the entrance. Meanwhile, the surface group spotted something terrifying. A lake of water had formed around the cave's entrance. The cavers inside had no idea how much water was about to flood the cave. The surface group ran to get help, while the cavers frantically tried to reach higher chambers. However, the water continued to rise, pressing toward their faces. Rescuers and hundreds of volunteers worked tirelessly, pumping water out of the cave and pumping oxygen inside, hoping that the cavers had found a safe chamber. Unfortunately, every one of the cavers drowned. Shaft Sinkhole Tragedy. It was May 28, 1973, and a group of 9 diving experts had planned a dive at Mount Dambier's Shaft Sinkhole. This sinkhole had a unique feature. There was only a tiny opening leading to a cave with a lake 20 feet below. From this opening, a beam of light went down into the cave and onto the lake, which was extremely helpful for the divers' orientation. This beam was visible throughout most of the cave, unless divers ventured too deep into one of the 2 side branches. Everyone initially agreed that they would stay within a 200-foot maximum depth range so they could remain in the main chamber and still see the guiding light. This was their only plan. On the second day, however, 4 divers planned to go to the western section of the cave, aiming for a depth of 250 feet, which would have been a new record. This was deeper than initially intended and posed a significant risk because, in 1973, divers were still using regular air cylinders rather than mixed gas tanks. For this reason, they had to be more cautious as they went downwards, because nitrogen narcosis might have settled in. As they went down, the increasing pressure would have pushed the nitrogen into the bloodstream, producing a state of consciousness that is similar to when people are drunk. Keep in mind that these divers were not very experienced in cave diving. They were more accustomed to standard open water scuba diving. This added even more risk to their plan. They started going downwards into the western section of the cave, and one experienced diver noticed that nitrogen narcosis was kicking in, so he immediately went back out. Several of them followed him and went back to the surface as well, but 4 of them kept going, determined to set the record and get a quick look before resurfacing. After a minute or so, the group at the surface became concerned, realizing the 4 divers would soon exhaust their air supply. A few returned to the cave to find them, and they discovered a flashlight and a camera on the bottom, but no trace of the divers. There was a problem that we haven't yet mentioned: silt. The movements of the 4 divers stirred up the long settled silt into a sand cloud that would take a lot of time to settle back. This reduced visibility to less than an arm's length, removing any hope for orientation for the underwater divers. Without being able to see anything, oxygen running dangerously low, and nitrogen narcosis kicking in, the 4 divers drowned. Hermit Cave Incident. It was April 5, 1999, when 21-year-old Robert Kennedy from Oklahoma set out on what was supposed to be a normal overnight camping trip near Hermit Cave. He was accompanied by 2 others, his stepbrother Richard and their mutual friend Ben. During the night, they gathered around a campfire and discussed the nearby cave, sharing legends and stories about its mysterious reputation. The next morning, as they were packing up to head home, their curiosity about the cave got the better of them. The cave was largely unmapped, adding an air of intrigue, so Robert proposed a quick exploration. Ben, however, had to leave early for work, so he headed back home, leaving Robert and Richard to decide for themselves. Robert and Richard entered the cave through its relatively large main entrance without much difficulty. Inside, Robert spotted one of the rumored side passages they had been talking about and decided to explore it. The narrow passage was too tight for more than one person, so Richard decided to wait outside the cave. Robert promised not to go too deep and assured Richard he'd be back soon. As Robert crawled forward, he encountered a section of the cave that was about 150 feet long and full of tight curves, making progress challenging. The real trouble began when he reached a particular point called the Keyhole Formation. This section was especially dangerous because it was impossible to exit legs first once passed. Unaware of this, Robert continued forward, but when the passage narrowed even further, he decided it was time to turn back. Returning to the Keyhole Formation, Robert realized something terrible. He couldn't pass through it feet first. His only option was to move forward through the even tighter crevice, hoping the cave would widen enough beyond it for him to turn around. What he didn't know was that the crevice sloped downward at a 30-degree angle. Exhausted, Robert squeezed through the space, exhaling all the air from his lungs just to fit. After several pushes, he reached a horrifying realization. He was stuck. Gravity was working against him, and every attempt to move only worsened his situation. Desperate, Robert began yelling for help, but Richard, waiting outside the cave, couldn't hear him. Worried after some time, Richard ventured into the cave by himself, though he had no flashlight because Robert had taken the only one. Crawling in complete darkness, Richard called out for Robert, who immediately yelled back, letting him know he was trapped and struggling to breathe. Realizing he couldn't reach his stepbrother in the pitch black, Richard left the cave to call for help, and about an hour later, a team of 10 rescuers arrived and began assessing the situation. The primary problem was Robert's location. He was trapped in an extremely deep area, approximately 150 feet from the cave's main entrance. This meant that drilling a shaft from above wasn't an option, so the only way to reach him was through the inside of the cave. The rescuers themselves began experiencing breathing difficulties due to the tight space, so they installed a ventilation system to pump warm air into the passages. Only one rescuer could work at a time due to the cave's tightness, and armed with manual tools, they began trying to widen the keyhole formation. However, the lack of space severely limited their maneuverability, and time was running out. Robert's breathing became more difficult, and he eventually stopped cooperating, making faint gurgling sounds, a sign of potential suffocation. After hours of effort, the rescuers managed to excavate through the keyhole formation and reach Robert's feet. Though unconscious, they felt a faint pulse, which gave them enough hope to try to get him out as quickly as possible. They immediately tried to pull him free, but unfortunately, the attempt failed. A pulley system was considered, but the cave's limestone and gypsum walls were too fragile to support the tension. With no other options, they continued digging around his body, which took an additional hour. When they finally freed Robert, they rushed him outside, where paramedics were waiting. Tragically, it was too late. After 5 hours of relentless rescue operations, Robert Kennedy was pronounced dead. Black Cave Tragedy. In April 1995, Thomas Edward Benning decided to visit Black Cave in Arizona. Having explored the cave before, he felt confident that this would be a relatively safe trip. He entered the cave alone, equipped only with an electric miner's lamp and no helmet. The first part of the cave was familiar to him, and he navigated it without any issues. However, at one point, he noticed a secret side passage that caught his attention. Drawn by curiosity, Thomas strayed from the main route he usually took and began exploring the darker, narrower passage. After venturing deeper into the unfamiliar passage for some time, Thomas decided it was time to turn back. But to his growing concern, he realized that an hour had passed and he was completely lost. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't retrace his steps to the familiar route. As panic began to set in, his situation worsened. His lamp started to flicker and eventually went out, leaving him in total darkness, miles underground. With no source of light, Thomas turned to his last resort, a box of matches. Striking one, he managed to create a faint glow that barely illuminated the rocks around him. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. He continued forward, using one match after another, but the matches burned out quickly, and soon he ran out entirely, leaving him once again surrounded by absolute darkness. Despite the circumstances, Thomas refused to give up. He devised a plan to leave behind small, useless items as markers to avoid circling back to the same spots. Starving, dehydrated, and utterly exhausted, he pressed on until he encountered the fissure, a narrow crack in the rock barely 4 feet deep. Believing this might be his only chance to reconnect with the familiar route or find a larger opening, he decided to enter it feet first. As he lowered himself into the gap, his hips dropped below the narrowest point, and he suddenly realized his mistake. He was completely wedged. His hips were firmly stuck between the rock walls, rendering him immobile. Using every last ounce of his strength, Thomas tried to lift himself back up, but it was no use. He was now trapped, alone, in the dark, with no one able to hear him. Days passed, and Thomas remained in the same position, growing weaker with each passing moment. Back home, his wife grew increasingly worried when he failed to return. She contacted the police, who began an extensive search of the caves in the area. Unfortunately, Thomas hadn't told anyone exactly which cave he planned to visit, leading rescuers to search blindly. Miraculously, rescuers eventually spotted his car parked near Black Cave. A rescue team entered the cave, carefully exploring all the mapped sections. They found some of Thomas's belongings, including his glasses and shirt, but they missed the secret side passage he had ventured into. Amazingly, Thomas was still alive at this point, though his condition was rapidly deteriorating. Days passed, and with no further progress, authorities unfortunately called off the search. Thomas was officially declared missing. Refusing to give up, his wife continued pleading with authorities to resume the search. She distributed flyers around the city and reached out to anyone who might have information, but unfortunately, she wouldn't have known about her husband for a long time. It wasn't until December 1996, over a year and a half later, that 3 other cavers exploring Black Cave stumbled upon Thomas's remains in the dark, narrow passage where he had become trapped.